Today, our sacred story comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became bright as light. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." But when the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone.
Transfiguration. It's kind of a funny word, isn't it? I went to a preschool called Transfiguration when I was little, and I didn't really know what it meant, but it sounded magical. It kind of sounds like transform, like a superhero. And that's kind of what it means. I used to really like this show called Sailor Moon. I still like it, but I don't really devote as much of my life to it these days. The main character was the superhero who used to be the Princess of the Moon a long time ago, but she was reborn in this time, or I guess the 90s really, as a normal girl. But she could transform into Sailor Moon and have superpowers. She had a really cool transformation too. It looked very magical. I would watch little GIFs of Sailor Moon transforming online, and it was the 90s, so that was a time commitment. It took our family computer an hour to load all of those things. But there was something magical about watching that moment of transformation. Now, I'm telling you about this not because I like superhero stories and strong female characters, although that's true, but because I think it's kind of similar to this story about Jesus. Jesus, who our stories tell us may have existed long before he came down to earth as a human, kind of does this magical transformation. We call it the Transfiguration because there was something really special about it. The story says that Jesus' clothes became dazzling white, and he seemed to glow and become very holy. Unlike some of our superheroes, he doesn't transform into muscles and a cape. He becomes more spiritual. He changes in a way that seems to make him radiate holiness. Now, I've had the privilege of visiting the Holy Land. So I got to go to many of the places that Jesus went in his lifetime. And one of the places that I went was called Mount Tabor, which is where the Transfiguration story is supposed to have happened. Maybe some of these photos can help you get an idea of how beautiful it is there. There is a church at the top called, you guessed it, the Church of the Transfiguration. The church is built on top of remains of an older church, like many churches in the Holy Land. There is a big, beautiful room with high ceilings and beautiful art. And off on either side of the chapel are 2 smaller chapels, one for Elijah and one for Moses. And there are big paintings of Elijah and Moses in them, so The church is built kind of how Peter wanted to build dwellings in our Bible story. There is a spot for Jesus, a spot for Moses, and a spot for Elijah. The floors in them are all still very old, from before the year 427. That's more than 1,597 years old. I did the math for you. You're welcome. For hundreds and hundreds of years, people have been coming to this special mountaintop to remember Jesus' transfiguration. You can kind of feel it in the air. There's a respect and a reverence that you feel in the people around you. And the view from the top is spectacular. And the sunset hitting the greenery and the facade of the church were beautiful. If Jesus chose that spot, I could see why. But in Jesus' time, that giant church wouldn't have been there. Those 1,500-year-old floors wouldn't have been there either. It was probably just Jesus, his followers, and nature. The scenery wouldn't have been the only different thing. When I was there, we drove up the mountain. So I had to use my imagination some because Jesus didn't drive up that mountain. He walked up. Let me tell you, it probably wasn't a fun walk. And in sandals. Can you imagine? When Peter, James, John, and Jesus got to the top of the mountain, they were probably tired and thirsty and sweaty. And then Jesus changes. He radiates holiness. And Moses and Elijah show up. I mean, it's kind of a crazy story, right? I think of like the end of the Return of the Jedi when Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Yoda all show up. But unlike Return of the Jedi, when Moses and Elijah show up, Peter, John, and James get pretty confused. Peter wants to make Moses, Elijah, and Jesus places to sleep. He thinks they're all going to hang out and have a sleepover. We can't blame the disciples for being confused, though, because this story is kind of confusing. When I went to the Church of the Transfiguration, nothing quite so confusing happened to me. But something changed. When I read Bible stories like the one we're talking about today, I don't think of them the way that my parents or grandparents thought of them. We're from different Christian traditions, but we're also from different times, and some of my grandparents were from different places. But one of the wonderful things about religion is how it connects us to generations past. When Jesus went to Mount Tabor, he had an experience. Something happened there that connected him in a new way to his ancestors. When I went to the Holy Land, I felt manifest an intense connection to my ancestors too. On both sides of my family, my grandparents who have passed on were very religious. I remember talking with my Grammy about how she wanted to go to the Holy Land. She never got to do that during her lifetime. But I did. I didn't know it before I went, but part of why I was going to these places was for my grandparents. So while I was there at these sacred places, I felt like I brought them with me. I think one of the wonderful things about the Christian faith is how it connects our lives with those before us. I can share a profound feeling of love and love of God with my spiritual ancestors, my spiritual family, through reading the same Bible they read, through partaking of the Eucharist like they did, through touching a piece of stone that millions of people throughout time have touched. Millions of people with a love of God and Jesus in their heart. There were moments when the presence of my grandmother felt so real that maybe I should have offered to make her a dwelling place. And I think that's part of what this story is about. That sense of connection that our faith brings us, not only to each other here and now, but to those who have gone before us, whether Moses, Jesus, or Charlene Wade. But I also think that this story is about change. Something changes about Jesus in this story. He becomes holy in a way that is seen and felt by his friends. The moment of connection with the past also becomes a moment of change and living into the future. It's almost as if Jesus finds, in encountering the prophets of the past, how he should live prophetically into the future. Jesus was continuing the tradition of his ancestors, but he was also doing something new with it. I hope that all of us, in thinking about the Transfiguration, can challenge ourselves to be rooted in the traditions that have helped make us, but not so stuck that we can't have an open mind. Following my roots was part of how I found my way to church. It's part of how I found my way to the Holy Land. Seeking change is part of what brings me here. Women aren't ministers in the faith traditions of either side of my family. We build upon our traditions. There is wisdom behind us and ahead of us. Where those types of wisdom come together, that's where we are transfigured. Amen.